This lecture was recorded for the Masters of Arts in Pastoral Counseling, Class 5302, by Dr. John T. Spody for Houston Baptist University. This lecture will specifically cover an article written by Tom Keller titled 4 Models of Counseling and Pastoral Ministry. One of the reasons that I really appreciated this article is because it was written from the perspective of a minister who is not a teacher nor a professor and has not a lot of experience in formalized counseling training. And so his perspective, I think, aligns with a lot of perspectives for other ministers as well. In his introduction, he says, "I am not a teacher of counseling, nor have I written anything about it except this paper. So I hardly think of myself as having marked out some new, perfectly balanced position. Rather, I am a working pastor, and over the years, I've had to ask myself, in light of all of these options and positions, what kind of counsel and counseling should I give to my people? What follows is my answer to that question." The first model he describes are levels of explanation model. He lists the affiliated groups, such as CAPS, and if you are unaware of CAPS, it's a great organization for Christians who are also psychologists. The Journal of Psychology and Christianity, and Fuller Seminary School of Psychology. The basic premise of this model is psychology and biblical theology deal with different dimensions of human life, use different methods of study, ask different questions, and look at two different things. The Bible looks at the human spirit and relationship to God. Psychology looks at how the human brain functions, how people adapt and react to natural and social environments. Psychology and biblical theology, therefore, provide insight that are complementary and not contradictory to one another. They should be kept distinct. Psychology is a science that, when conducted properly, goes a long way to eliminate the biases of the researcher. The bottom line he takes from this model is that there's no real biblical critique of modern psychology. His criticism goes on for a while, but here's a short summary. He writes, "In actuality, modern psychology and biblical theology do look at many of the same things: motivations, suffering, abuse, anger, worry, fear, a desire for meaning in life, and so on. Thus, this view does not really take seriously the strength and comprehensiveness of the claims of either psychology or theology. The only possible way to hold that psychology and theology operate independently of one another at different levels is to support the view, ironically a very specific theological view, that the soul and the spirit are two different things. The final result is that the Bible is not permitted access to part of the human life over which it claims authority." Next, he discusses the integration model. The integration model is affiliated with the following groups: Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University, La Merida, California, the American Association of Christian Counselors, and Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. The basic premise of the integration model is psychology and biblical theology are both looking at the same thing, human nature, what's gone wrong with it, and how it can be made right. But they are using two different tools to study human beings: general revelation, such as scientific observation, and special revelation, the will of God revealed in the Bible. Integrationists combine the insights of science with the insights of the Bible, and where the two conflict, they want to allow the Bible to hold sway. Thus, in the integration model, unlike the levels of explanation model, the Bible is used to critique modern scientific psychology. The bottom line Keller takes away from this is that the integration model provides some real biblical critique of modern psychology, but it can be rather inconsequential. His criticism of integration model is that this approach, as stated, integration psychology with the Bible, is simply too elastic. At one end of the spectrum, it could mean simply supplementing a rather strong biblical approach with insights from psychology. At the other end, it could mean adopting modern psychological counseling methods wholesale with just a sprinkle of supportive biblical references and prayer. It is no wonder that counseling associations based on this model have split. Counselors at opposite ends of the spectrum, both claiming to be integrationist, could be extremely different in their approaches. In practical terms, the integrationist counselor could use any psychological technique not directly ruled out by the Bible. So in the end, it is important to realize that a counselor who says he or she is an integrationist is not telling us much. That could mean almost anything. Christian Psychology Model. This is affiliated with Covenant Theological Seminary in Missouri. Christian Psychological Model. Keller says the basic premise for the Christian psychological model is that counseling cannot be done with an eclectic grab bag of techniques and procedures. While everyone can gain insights from counseling from psychology, the real question is, what is foundationally wrong with the human beings and what will put them right? The answer constitutes one's theory narrative of human nature, which is what fundamentally controls one's counseling advice. The answer should come from biblical theology, since one's theory narrative cannot be deduced from science. The Christian psychology model understands that psychology is not an objective, empirical science, but is theory-laden. It proceeds from the underlying philosophical and religious assumption about human nature, and it tries to locate the ultimate problem with people in something other than sin. Christian psychology therefore insists that counselors must have a strong biblical theory narrative as their foundation. The Bible must critique psychology systematically at its theory narrative level, not in a piecemeal way emphasizing specific psychological practices. Unlike the biblical counseling model, however, the approach leaves counselors free to incorporate psychological insights, especially from modern theory narrative that come closer to a Christian understanding of creation, fall, and redemption. This view also, more than any of the others, looks at the past, to the church fathers and traditional soul physicians for insight. Keller's bottom line for Christian psychological model is that it is a very strong critique of modern psychology combined with a certain willingness to use psychological terms and techniques. His criticism of this technique is that the biblical counseling model critiques this approach on the premise that it grants too much power to experts in counseling. The biblical counseling movement has always been an exercise of populism, a rebellion against the professionalization and elitism of psychology. Biblical counseling contends that psychological insights and methods are tainted and warped by underlying false theory narratives and world views. It dislikes using the terminology of modern psychology, but some of these differences may be mostly matters of temperament or judgment rather than major divergences based on principle. Finally, the biblical counseling model. This is affiliated with the National Association of Nouthetic Counselors and the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. Finally, Keller discusses the biblical counseling model. The basic premise is that the biblical counseling model is united in its conviction that modern psychology brings with its underlying non-empirical, quasi-religious theory narratives of human nature that don't fit with biblical revelation. In short, this theory avoids using the fundamental issues of behavior, as in behaviorism, thinking, as in cognitions, or cognitive therapy, or emotions as in psychodynamic objective relations. According to biblical counseling model, our basic problem is that we worship and put our faith in lesser gods. If this is the problem, neither simple acts of the will or right thinking favored by more conservative counselors, nor loving relationships and emotional exploration favored by more liberal counselors will provide more than superficial help. The CCEF wing of the biblical counseling movement does incorporate insights from psychology, but only very carefully. For example, its understanding of idolatry and motivation is given some confirmation to Alfred Adler's psychology. Keller's bottom line for this type of counseling is that this model represents the strongest critique of psychology and shows the least inclination to incorporate insights from that discipline. And he goes on to critique the model. The biblical counseling movement is somewhat divided, as noted above. Though the theory looks extremely attractive, it may be that it appeals to a certain kind of temperament, one that prefers exhortation to loving and listening. It is important to check the validity of the criticism, but what is often said about counselors using this model is that they tend to do more confronting than comforting. They identify behavioral patterns rather than exploring deeper motivational issues and family background patterns, and they often use behavioral and cognitive therapy techniques anyway. These criticisms are likely more applicable to hardcore factions of this movement than to more modern practitioners. Still, the charge that biblical counseling therapists tend to simply call people to repent should be taken seriously. It may be that the practice of the movement in general is not nearly as nuanced as the articulate expression of it. Many counselors in this tradition seem unwilling to explore the complex relationship between physiology and behavior. That is, a person with a real spiritual fear or anger problem may, at the same time, have a physiological makeup that greatly aggravates the problem. Many counselors in this tradition, though rightly speaking of idols of the heart, underestimate how long and complex a process it is to disentangle the heart from those idols. Finally, in Keller's article, he makes a spectrum of these four models of counseling. On the left-hand side are models that are less open to psychology, and on the right-hand side are models that are more open to psychology. On the far right, we see biblical counseling, followed by Christian psychology, followed by the integration model, and finished off with levels of explanation model.